Great. So yeah, I was going to change the subject a little bit. I have a master's degree in engineering, and I would like to argue that the lack of irreducible complexity in life is probably not a convincing argument against design rather than evolution. Personally, I would say that you get the same kind of patterns of the lack of irreducible complexity in engineered designs. You don't find people creating extremely complicated machines or devices overnight. It kind of builds up from very simple things. Like it's reckoned that the wheel took maybe thousands of years, and that's maybe one of the simplest mechanisms we have. And it's things like that that's been gradually incremented each time in order to create what we have now, which follows the same pattern evolution does. However, I would say that the way, if you look at things that are designed compared to things that have evolved, the difference is, although you should get the same kind of pattern of change over time, you don't get kind of like cross information, if that's maybe a good word for it. Like for example, you have certain species that fly, like insects or birds, but you can tell that they will develop themselves individually. While, say, if you had, say, something like, say, look back 100 years ago, take certain mechanisms such as a sewing machine or a drill or things like that. They're both very different items which do very different tasks, and they were both developed separately to each other. But when the electric motor came along, that was implemented into several different applications, including both sewing machines and drills. So you find that as one development in design, you find that as one development becomes available, all sorts of different items that already exist take on that characteristic, which you don't see in evolution, which is why, which is more of, I would say, a better convincing argument for evolution over design than the creationist argument of irreducible complexity, which I would say isn't really an argument for design, evolution over design. And I'd like your opinion on that.
Oh, well, Mr. DeWitt, I think you've nicely summarized a video that I made called "Falsifying Phylogeny," where I talk about something almost exactly like that. One of the ways that design that intentional or deliberate design tends to differ from the designs that we see incrementally constructed by nature, and that if we were talking about a bureau of designers or a team of fallible designers, we might get something that seemed similar to evolution in some respects. But if we're talking about an infallible designer, then the patterns that we're showing are not consistent with that suggestion. There's another hypothesis it is consistent with, and that would be evolution or the incompetent designer teams.
Yeah. Actually, I've had an idea. You know how with a theory, when you take new evidence to a theory, you change your theory. Well, if you look at how there's so many flaws with design, couldn't you change intelligent design theory to retarded design theory?
I would rather say bureaucratic design theory. I wrote an article about that, about the team of specialists that were working on creating the scorpion versus a team of specialists working on creating a crocodile, for example, and how they end up competing with each other and other animal lineages as well.
That's more of a joke, though. Rather saying if they were a designer, the fact that there's so many flaws in its creations, that God's actually retarded. But sorry, that was a terrible joke.
I think Concordance wanted to add something.
Yeah, the DI fellows will certainly say, and they say it a lot actually, is we said intelligent design, not perfect design. But I've talked about this as well. The difference between top-down design, where you have a purpose in mind, and you put together something that is for the purpose, and clearly has hallmarks of being put together exclusively for a purpose, and then bottom-up design, which evolution does. There is design in nature, but it's a bottom-up design, meaning the process of inheritance and selection, any kind of selection, it could be artificial or natural, will tend to produce structures that reach a certain fitness level, that tend towards a fitness peak. And we can see that process in action. And I think understanding that, trying to deny that design exists in nature is a challenge, because obviously certain structures have hallmarks of design, but they're not top-down design. They're tinkerers. They're the result of lots of little processes going on disparate directions and having to inherit a lot of. They can only work with what they already have, right? So you'll see this sort of hodgepodge of little bits and bobs, genes made from other genes, badly functional, or they have to turn off 90% of the structure in the gene so that the part that's just been introduced can still be functional. You get genes that sort of arise from mutations in other genes. Right? That's not what we would anticipate an intelligent agent doing, unless the intelligent agent was making themselves intentionally undetectable in the process. And I think that's where we ought to focus the argument against intelligent design and irreducible complexity, is not to deny that design exists, but to point out that the kind of design that we see is something we have a very clear explanation for. And the hallmarks of design that we do see is repurposing, not top-down but bottom-up design.
Actually, I also have to disagree with that. I would say that it is actually, in some respects, top-down, because obviously when you design something, you have a purpose for it, which you then try and find a solution to produce or overcome the problem. And I think the top-down design for evolution is just survival. Your specification is say this needs to survive. What can be done to do that? And I think design and evolution through natural selection are very, very similar concepts. I mean, when you first, say when you look at when airplanes started being designed, you find you have a huge variety of different airplanes. But then as they were tested and designed, they become more and more refined. So in a way, you kind of have the very similar mechanism of evolution in the design, even though the details of how it comes about to design these things is completely different to how it would be in nature.
Well, let's take an example, a concrete example, the flipper of a whale, right? The flipper of a whale is evolved from the bones of the hand. And at the same time, the fins of fish are completely different in embryology and physiology, right? And the fact that you have an existing structure, a hand or a foot, that becomes a flipper, right? It's repurposed from something else. You don't see the same thing in airplane manufacturing. You would never see, let's say, the wheels of a car being modified in such a way that they become the wings of an airplane, right? You don't find radial tires that have developed fins so that they're better at being a helicopter, and you don't see this continuous progression between them. And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about with bottom-up. You're taking existing structures and you're allowing for all this failure, but it's an undirected process. It doesn't have the goal in mind. So it wanders all over this fitness landscape until it finds a point where it starts to get a return. It starts to get a little crack in the reward system, like trying to crack a safe, and the safe opens up just a little bit every time you get closer and closer to the number.
Yes, I agree with you with that, but that's not quite what I'm saying. I mean, in a way, that's not like an example between, say, a car and an airplane. Although, yes, they were designed by different people in different ways. But I mean, the overall concept of a vehicle is the same. I mean, if cars didn't exist, it'd be a much bigger step to go from nothing to an airplane. In a way, you could argue that things like horse and carts and cars and all sorts of things needed to come before an airplane could be invented. Plus, not to mention all the mechanisms, all the electronic circuitry, all the the science of geography needed in order to map things out. I mean, it's not like somebody came out of nowhere saying, I think I'll make an airplane today. I mean, it needed a vast amount of prior knowledge before you could actually get to the stage where you could build an airplane.
I think it's always dangerous to get too fixated on analogies. And I'm all prepared to talk about Leonardo da Vinci and his helicopter, and what was it closest to? It was closest to nothing. I mean, it was completely the fabric of his brain. But let's not get obsessed with the analogies that we're dealing with. The fact is that the kind of design hallmarks that we see are adaptive hallmarks, not non-adaptive, and that's the technical term for it. Is you need a certain amount of non-adaptive movement. But generally, we see movement along adaptive slopes, and that's what drives evolution.
Yes.
About impacted molars and why we get them, and they said that the human mandible had essentially shortened too quickly over the course of many thousands of years, or whatever time span they gave. But you look at earlier hominids, and their front teeth and their whole mandible extends several inches forward from what we have, and therefore we just have more teeth, either whether it was a natural selective trait or a sexual trait to get the shorter mandible and the flatter face. We just, our jaws and the amount of space for our teeth rapidly receded, but the number of teeth and their size didn't shrink in accordance with that. So that now we get impacted molars because we get our wisdom teeth coming in and there just isn't enough room in our mouths because it's a hidden trait. And if it's not dangerous enough that it causes a regular quota of fatalities to the point it weeds itself out, then it's going to stay. In addition to that, it's not going to be used as a sexual trait because most people can't see it. So therefore, it's not part of the human system of plumage for attracting a mate. Nobody selects their mate based on whether they have impacted molars. So now we get this thing that is clearly an indication that we are, our human dentistry, our makeup of our teeth is, has 1 foot in one realm and 1 foot in the other realm. And I think I talked to a pastor about this, and he said that wisdom teeth are just another form of punishment, and it's God's will and all that kind of gobbledygook. But I think it's pretty clear that if we're perfectly designed, then you would have the correct number of teeth of the correct size for the jaw that you had every time without exception.
And I think you have to peel back the layers or pull back the curtain and really confront what the argument is behind intelligent design creationism. And that is, at some point, the natural processes that we have observed and are familiar with were discontinued and magic took place, right? Some sort of a supernatural event occurred because the natural process was inadequate to explain the modification or the change. You have to keep coming back to that. It means that we need magic to explain it. Magic, supernatural, divine magic, whatever. We had a poof, and that's what, these wonderful scientists who can get up on the stage and show these marvelous presentations about how these detailed embryological conditions are, they're still advocating for magical intervention.
I think this is on topic, DPR, because if we're created in His image, does that mean that God gets inflamed appendices and things like that? Does God have an impacted molar, and are we defying His will by removing ours?